Hello gamers and welcome back. I'm Rob, of course, or Warshack if you want to call me by my in-game name, and we're going to go ahead and cover my top 5 budget mid-range decks to build. We already went over the more aggressive base decks, which should have been posted right before this. So these mid-range decks, for those of you unfamiliar with kind of the breakdown of the archetypes of decks you can play very aggressive based decks, you can play mid-range, which has a combination of both aggressive and control decks, and then followed by control decks, which are a lot more late game oriented. Keep in mind as you move through these decks that the aggressive decks will always normally be cheaper than the mid-range will be cheaper than the control, with the control being again the most expensive decks that we can go over. Also keep in mind that these budget based decks are targeting, the free-to-play players, the new players freshly into Hearthstone, and the intermediate players who may just not play that much but are looking to play a decent budget deck, because I know again these tier 1 tier 2 decks very overwhelming. The dust count on some of these decks have multiple legendaries, and there's just really no way for any newer player to even come close to building some of these decks, which is totally understandable, and that's what these particular series is hoping to aim to help, right? So with that, let's head into the first deck here, which is going to be sort of like the Tempo Elemental Mage. We've been playing a lot of this particular deck on stream recently, and I've been very impressed with the results, and it's also a pretty fun deck to play. Also, a little side note, there's no legendaries in any of my decks, there's not even any epics, and there are a few rares, which I've tried to keep down to a minimum, but for the most part, these decks are very, very cheap in regards to how high they can get you on ladder. They're not legend decks, don't get me wrong there, but they can take you to what I think at least rank 10 if you play the deck well and you're comfortable doing so. So looking at this Elemental Tempo Mage deck, it has exactly the same kind of bursty opener that any mage does, with the Mana Worm, the Cult Sorcerer, and of course the Sorcerer's Apprentice, all of those cards being pretty sizable threats throughout the game, whether they stick around for multiple turns or whether you can combo spells with them immediately, right? From there, we're playing the Shimmering Tempest. This is like not one of my favorite cards in the deck due to the fact that he is a 2-drop 2/1 that gives you a random card, but because you're playing a budget deck, being able to generate random cards is actually pretty important to you, due to the fact that that random card could be something that you wouldn't normally be able to put in the deck because you don't actually have the card. So for example, Pyroblast rings a bell, Kabbalist Tome rings a bell. Cards like this, are Meteor, some of those more epic cards are late game cards that we wouldn't normally be able to afford. The Shimmering Tempest can provide. I also would have normally put Babbling Book in these decks, but again, we're not running any of the adventure mode cards. This is a budget based deck, and we have to cut a lot out, but with doing so, we made room for a lot of cool stuff, like the Mirror Entity, which can definitely throw people off depending on the turn that you play it, and then kind of honing what your opponent is going to do. So for example, you play against a Druid, the Druid ramps up until turn 6 or 7, you can see they're wanting to play some big minion. You drop a Mirror Entity before that. They can either acknowledge that they could be a Mirror Entity and it skews their game plan, or they're just going to play right into it and you're actually going to be able to hopefully make a trade into their creature the following turn. Normally, a lot of these mage decks don't run polymorph right now, which is a perfect example why we're going to run one polymorph, because people actually won't play around it. None of my current tempo mage decks, or even some of my later control mage, don't even play polymorph due to the fact that there's cards like Meteor and Pyroblast, along with the ability to play multiple tomes, which could generate again polymorphs or meteors and whatnot like that. But just having a that oh shit button in the deck for if your opponent plays a creature and you don't like it's very powerful. But besides that, looking at the deck, curves out exceedingly well. You've got the combination of really strong, annoying minions on top of being able to burst your opponent out with fireballs, frostbolts, and of course the Fireland portals. For those of you wondering, hey Rob, Fireland's portal did come from the Karazhan expansion. You're exactly right, but you actually can play the pre-log for free and unlock Fireland's portal and Enchanted Raven for free. All you have to do is battle the first guy, and it actually doesn't cost you anything. So I didn't really count that as it costing money due to the fact that it is free to get. But besides that, very interesting, very fast. I don't want to say very fast paced because, again, if we looked at the aggro decks, if you happen to watch that video before this, a lot of those decks had, they capped out at 4 or 5 mana with the biggest creatures in the deck. So like Zoo had Doomguard, Hunter had like Infested Wolf, and for this one, it capping out at 7, you know, that's pushing more towards that late game, while it does have the mixture of being very aggressive here at the start as well. So cool deck, definitely entice you to play it if you have the extra time and dust to be able to craft something like this. And keep in mind, it only costs 1,000 dust, so it's pretty cheap. The next one's going to be a Tempo Warrior. So it may look kind of similar to the Pirate Warrior, and it also may not be as strong as the Pirate Warrior, but there's still, I think, room in this meta for some form of Tempo Warrior, which is what we have here. Tempo Warrior actually used to be a force to be reckoned with. Prior to the Mean Streets of Gadgetzan release, there was this sort of Tempo Warrior deck, and then it kind of morphed into a Dragon Tempo Warrior deck, and we didn't really see as much Tempo Warrior anymore. We always saw it with the dragon package in there, but I think a deck like this, there's still room for it to be fit into the meta due to the fact that Battle Rage is really powerful. Of course, Grimy Gadgeteer is actually powerful, and of course Frothing Berserker, and those are kind of cards that can win you games on their own, based on kind of how you use them. You know, if a Gadgeteer sits on the board for 2 turns and those +2/+2s land on your elite, all of a sudden you have a 4 mana 8 charge damage minion. Wow, I don't know why I couldn't say that, but anyway, yeah, basically drop a minion every turn. The minions are overly statted and very powerful. You've got cards like Fiery War Axe, Executes to be able to deal with your opponent's board. You've got Alkali to Pain and Battle Rage to be able to continue to keep the gas rolling. And then you also have very high-end minions like the Bloodhoof Brave, the Elite, the Spellbreaker, and the Arcanite Reaper. And the Spellbreaker, you could be like, well, why do you have a Spellbreaker in the deck? And the reason is right now, Taunt Warrior is a very real thing, and they're really annoying. So I figured, why not just silence them? This deck, its main purpose is to get on the board and start doing large quantities of damage and play a lot of minions on curve quickly. So what better card to kind of keep the curve going and to stop what your opponent's doing, or at least disrupt it, especially if they're playing an annoying taunt deck, or a what is that card? The Quest Rogue deck, where their death rattles create more of the fire elementals. I found that the Spellbreaker works really, really well against that as well. So interesting deck. I would have to say, if you had the option between, like, you know, the Elemental Tempo Mage or the Tempo Warrior, I would go with the Elemental Mage. But if you really enjoy Warrior, I figured I would put this deck in there because it is a pretty cool deck to play, and a lot of people, it'll surprise most. Looking at this is going to be the Midrange Hunter list. This is very, very close to what you're actually going to see most Legend players playing, because the deck in itself does not cost that much. There's a few cards that I have left out due to the fact that, again, it is a budget-based deck, and I couldn't include everything I wanted to, but I tried to replace those cards with as many other cards as I could with other particular abilities that synergize either well with the deck or well with each other. The Savaging Hyena is actually a card that will win you games by itself, and the fact that it's very cheap to throw in a deck, it helps you guys out a ton. We're able to, of course, include the Tundra Rhino and Savannah Highmane. I still don't understand how Savannah Highmane is not considered like a legendary minion, right? Due to the fact that the card is just insane. Like, if you're able to live until turn 6 and you have the health to do so, and you drop like Savannah Highmane into Savannah Highmane, it's just GG. Like, most decks can't keep up with that. On top of that, you have an amazing curve to open up to. We've included the Knife Juggler. I know this was in our Face Hunter list as well, but being able to fit it into this list was quite nice, because again, we still have Infested Wolves and Unleash the Hounds to be able to combo with that Knife Juggler to get that ultimate value. And on top of that, I know we couldn't fit in Rat Pack, but again, that was an epic card, and I had to cut a few cards, and the cards I cut for 2 Rat Pats are the Deadly Shot and the Hunter's Mark. And this is kind of, again, if you play against Taunt Warrior, really, really annoying to deck, really annoying deck to go against, especially with all their, like, you know, high HP taunts. So what better way to get rid of those with Hunter's Mark and Deadly Shot? On top of that, there's also a lot of Murloc running around, and as we know, Finja, is one of the kind of most annoying murlocs that we can deal with due to the fact that it has stealth, meaning it's most likely going to be able to kill something the following turn, and this deadly shot allows you to actually kill a minion even if it's in stealth, as long as it's the only minion on their board, because it has to kill something. Even if they have multiple minions and you can't kill them all, it's still worth to probably deadly shot and try to kill Finja. But either way, we've teched in additional cards to be able to deal with popular meta decks right now, which is again really important in building a budget-based deck, because while you may not have the most powerful cards, you can, you know, put in cards that maybe counter or give the more powerful cards a really tough time and a run for their money, literally. So the next one's going to be this Jade Golem Shaman. So as we know, the Jade package is pretty cheap in regards to being able to build it, because once you get kind of your where are they at? The Jade Spirits and Aya Blackpaw, they can kind of fit into whatever Jade deck you want, and those are the kind of, not the most expensive, with Aya being the most expensive, but fairly cheap package to put into decks for how powerful it really is. So getting the Jade package for your mid-range and control decks really isn't a bad idea either. So what this deck is trying to do is, it's in the early game, it doesn't really have much. You're probably going to be hero powering a lot because I've included 2 Thing from Belows in the deck, but from there you have the ability to ramp with the Jades with Jade Claws, of course the Jade Lightning, Jade Spirit, and the Jade Chieftain. From there, once you get either a lot of totems or a lot of mid-range Jades on the board, we can go ahead and Bloodlust, finish up your opponent. There's also 2 Flame Tongues to be able to kind of stop what your opponent's doing with your smaller minions, so you'll be able to trade into larger things. The double mana tides are really important because this deck doesn't actually have Azure Drake anymore because it got rotated into the wild format, which means we need some form of draw. I would normally put in Blood Mage, but she's a legendary, so the only option we have there is kind of the 2 mana tides, which I think is, again, what I said was very important for draw. The Devolve is kind of an interesting tech. Again, works really well against Finja, and Murloc's really powerful deck right now, Paladin Murloc, and it's really annoying, and the Devolve kind of ruins the deck. Your opponent, let's say they have 3 or 4 Murlocs, most of them are between 2 and 3 mana cost, and they all synergize well together, especially if they have War Leader out. But if the second you drop Devolve, all of a sudden their board turns into like 1/2s or 2/1s, and you can easily kind of clear the field with a Lightning Storm. Not a big deal there, but power level wise, really powerful deck in regards to the lower ranks. Again, we couldn't really fit in Maelstrom Portal and things like that, so I kind of had to do my best with the Earth Shock and Acidic Swamp Ooze, which are still good cards. Maybe not as powerful as Maelstrom, but you'll still find room for them in play, and it'll actually do a lot of work if you play them correctly. So the last deck we're going to take a look at is this Handbuff Elemental Paladin deck, very similar to what kind of Kalento was running. Again, we kind of had to budget down it, and not to say it won't still work. The core concept of the deck is there. Be able to give yourself a pretty sizable hand with I don't want to say decently statted minions, because Firefly, Grim Street Outfitter, and Hydrologist are not maybe the most powerful minions, but the ability to be able to buff them with Smuggler's Run, the Outfitter, and of course the Enforcer is really powerful. So not only are you playing, you know, your elementals every turn, a lot of cards in the deck buff each other, so when you end up playing the elementals, or you, like, let's say your Ignis Elemental dies, it puts this 2 1/2s in your hand, and you can buff them by 2+2 or 1+1. All of a sudden you have 1 drop 2 3s, and that kind of works really well in regards to not only value, but being able to swarm your opponent down. And then for the late game, of course, with this being a mid-range deck, there needs to be some form of late game. We've got the Servant of Kalamos, the Spike Ridge Steed, and the Protector. And you could be like, well, Rob, why do you have the Protector in the deck? Divine Shield is surprisingly good, guys. With it being a 7-drop, it itself has Taunt, and then it gives both creatures next to it Divine Shield. It's just a card that no one is currently really playing around, which, again, it's not that popular, so it makes sense that no one would play around it. But, you know, not only will it give you 2 good pickups, because it's going to provide the creatures next to it with Divine Shield, it's also a good body in itself, and it has Taunt if you're playing against, you know, a more aggressive base deck. So as weird as this deck looks, I think it's one of the more powerful decks we actually have listed in our review. And really fun being able to play giant minions that were once very small. You know, being able to see your young cards grow to an age and mature is very important. And on top of that, it does fairly well against aggressive base decks due to the fact that you have a pretty, I don't want to say explosive start, but for the most part, you're going to be able to curve out. And you have kind of annoying cards in the deck, right? Aldor Peacekeeper turns things that you know, have high attack and to basically, what is the word I'm looking for? Wet paper noodle, but that doesn't sound right. A wet noodle, I guess you could call a card like that a wet noodle after you make its attack, after you give its reduce its attack down to 1. The Tar Creeper again, taunt, really annoying for aggro decks to get behind. The Consecration, of course, is nice, and then you basically follow those up with a Spike Ridge Steed, which turns the creature into a taunt, buffs its HP, and then makes another taunt. So if you're finding yourself playing against, you know, a lot of Pirate Warrior, this wouldn't actually be a bad deck to kind of throw out there and see how it does. For the most part, it did really well for me. I didn't run this exact version, but I did run a similar version. It worked out pretty well against most decks I went against. It really didn't have like a true weak spot other than maybe like Freeze Mage, where of course you don't have any healing in the deck, but how popular is Freeze Mage, right? So with that, that's going to wrap up our top 5 budget-based mid-range decks. If you have anything to further add to what I've mentioned, or you want to just say whatever, feel free to in the comment section below to help those players who are interested in these decks kind of learn a little bit more and kind of add on to what I may have not spoken about, because again, I can't cover every single topic I want to, or these videos would be like 3 hours long and we'd like, you'd be Hearthstoned out before you even tried the deck. So with that, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys, and of course I will hopefully catch you guys in our control budget based deck, which should be coming out very shortly after this. So as always, I'm Warshack, and happy whatever the hell day it is.